Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest iteration of All Tech is Humans live stream series. Here in 2025, we're going to be doing a live stream at least twice a month, typically at this time on Thursday. So if you have an idea for us of what we should discuss, please drop us a line at hello@alltechishuman.org. Or if you're on our Slack community, where we have over 11,000 members across 105 countries, all across civil society, government, industry, academia, you name it. We've got everybody there, and we hope to have you there as well if you're not already a part of it. Good way to share your ideas, find out what's going on locally by you, find out about new jobs, introductions, build your community, build your knowledge in responsible tech. Hello, I'm David Ryan Polgar, the founder and president of All Tech is Human, a nonprofit committed to tackling the thorniest tech and society issues, right? And we do this through collective understanding, involvement, and action. So really coming together to determine what our better tech future looks like, and then charting a course towards that better tech future. In today's discussion, we're going to be bringing on Deb Donig. Deb recently started with us as our Siegel Research Fellow for the next 2 years, really digging into all this great research around the changing responsible tech or public interest technology ecosystem, what it looks like, what careers look like, you name it. So love to use this time. Go in the chat, ask us a question, put a comment in there, and obviously stay involved with All Tech is Human. You can find all of our links, such as the Slack community that I mentioned. If you go to alltechishuman.org. We also have a link tree that has all of these upcoming live streams, upcoming in-person gatherings, some of our recent reports, such as a new AI governance one that we just put out last week, along with our Responsible Tech Guide that you can see directly at responsibletechguide.com. But without further ado, I'm going to bring on Deb Donig.
Hi, everybody. Hey, Deb, hi.
Great to see you here.
Good to see you too.
How is 2025 treating you so far?
2025 has been pretty eventful. We are looking at a number of different inflection points and changes to the responsible tech ecosystem. In particular, incoming administration may have, or is, I think, very likely, at least has promised to have a significant impact on the tech industry, and probably in significant proportion the tech industry in relationship to things like civil rights and responsible tech practices. We also have a new, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, commentary announcement by Mark Zuckerberg that there will be a significant change in policy at his company Meta in terms of content moderation and review, a change in policy that will not only, I think, inflect that platform and the activities of responsible tech practice on that platform, but may also send signal to the rest of the industry. And I'm sure we'll get into that later. So happy to talk about that more.
We certainly will, Deb, because I got to tell you that Meta's recent announcement seemed to be half of my LinkedIn feed. So that either means that I'm a super nerd, or everybody really wants to talk about this, or potentially both of those can be true, right? They're not mutually exclusive. But before we really get in, and I do have a few questions that I wanted to bring up specifically around your recent piece that was called, and you can see this on alltechishuman.org in our blog, Our Responsible Tech Future Depends on Investing in the Responsible Tech Pipeline. So laying it out right there in the title. But before we get into that, love to just have you tell a little bit about your background, and then kind of your involvement with this public interest technology, responsible tech field, to kind of just set a little bit of the table setting and give people a background who are tuning in right now. And again, use this time to use the chat if you have any questions for myself or for Deb. So Deb, love to hear a little bit about your background before we dig in.
Sure. So just a little bit about where I am now. I teach at UC Berkeley in the School of Information, and for the next 2 years, I'm going to be working on the responsible tech ecosystem. But I actually am a professor of English literature by training. My PhD is in English literature. And so when I present that, I sometimes get some funny looks. asking, and the question, I think it's an intuitive question. Why is a professor of English literature, or how is a professor of English literature talking and thinking about responsible tech practices and pipelines? And uh, to that question, I say, in addition to the fact that my pre-academic background is in startups, and my dissertation work focused on human rights, the process and the premise of English literature is that we inspect our imagination and how we imagine, what stories we tell, and what stories we know, so that we live based on the templates that the stories that we know. This is something we know about human consciousness. And I say that before we can build anything, we first have to imagine it. Before we build a tech product, we imagine it. In fact, some of the great tech products, including the idea of the metaverse, which Mark Zuckerberg now takes as the label for his enterprise, come out of science fiction. And so I'm really interested in the stories that we know, the stories that we tell, in particular, what stories we tell about the version of the good that technological products are meant to move toward. We tend to think about tech and technological progress as moving us toward a better world. So I want to understand what stories we have about what a better world looks like and what it means. And I also understand the importance of identifying and paying attention to who gets to tell those stories and who gets to imagine. And in my work thinking about how we build pipelines to a responsible tech industry, I am increasingly interested in whose imagination gets animated when we build technological products, and how we can build a more inclusive atmosphere. And when I say inclusive, I think about the number of different people who come with a number of different perspectives, intellectual backgrounds, cultural additives, etc., and how we can get them into situations where they are able to add those perspectives to the broader context of technological conversations, technological production, technological culture.
And what I would say with that, I mean, what you brought up about different visions, and then potentially more importantly, who has the megaphone, who has the actual greater hand in cultivating what this future ends up looking like. Definitely like to underline your point around the metaverse. I've seen lots of different opinions on it. Certainly lots of people in the community who have gone all in about it. But if you look at Meta's example and other companies, obviously that bet has really turned quite sour. And I think if you analyzed it, or if I thought about it, I would say they're reading the room wrong, because their vision of an ideal connectivity might have been wearing a headset. But when we think about our experience during COVID, I got to tell you, the last thing in the world that I would want is a greater disconnect. Obviously, you can frame the virtual world as a connection to something that you could not physically be at. However, that's not certainly something that motivated me as an individual. And I think what we've seen with the metaverse as of right now, sputtering, the numbers are extremely low. You really see that disconnect sometimes between our visions. So in other words, one person's utopian vision might be another person's dystopian vision. So when I think a lot of times people saw the disembodied person without legs at first, you would say, wow, that doesn't look like a future that I want to live in. So any other thoughts, Deb, on that? Because if you think about it, you basically have individuals who are arguing, hey, this is what a better tech future looks like, and we're going in that direction. But you effectively saw consumers speaking with their wallet by actually saying, well, then I'm not going to buy this because that's not my vision. So what do you think you can learn, or what can we as a society learn from something like that?
Well, I'll give a two-part answer to this question. The first part is really looking definitionally at what we mean by connection. This is a really good paradigmatic example, because one definition of maximizing connection is to create a social media platform where you can identify and create links to everybody that you know, right? This is a one definition of connectivity, and this is the definition of connectivity that Mark Zuckerberg proposed and on which this platform is built. It's built on maximizing engagement, maximizing connectivity, right? But we could define connectivity in a very different way. In fact, connectivity as defined per number of people you are connected to is a quantification of connectivity on the level of number of connections. But you could also identify connectivity as the depth of connections. And in fact, the number of connections we know sociologists have identified actually tends to create surface connections rather than depth connections. And the more connections we have on the surface, the fewer we tend to have in depth. So another way of measuring connectivity is how deep are your connections? And in fact, we know that social media activities tend to create shallow connections rather than deep ones. So again, it depends on how you're thinking about connectivity. An engineering way of thinking about connectivity might be number of connections, right? A psychological or social definition of connectivity might mean depth of connections. This is why intellectual, I think, diversity is really important in developing these products and thinking about the direction that we want them to go. Now, of course, connectivity for Mark Zuckerberg, who grew up in a context of the United States, where mostly in suburban environments that have a higher degree of wealth, might see the opportunity in maximizing connections as an opportunity to grow his social bandwidth. But as we saw, as that product got exported to very different environments, connectivity does not always mean, having a better social life. It can also mean mobilizing a genocide, right? And so this idea of connectivity, I think, really ought to be thought about and inspected by a global diversity of people from different social contexts. So we're talking about intellectual diversity, we're talking about social diversity, the impact of which is not just for a abstract social good, but also because the products in accumulating a diversity of thinkers have the opportunity to inspect these values and identify whether we are not fundamentally moving toward them or whether we are. Now, I just want to give one last paragraph of information. I know that we have a lot of things to talk about in a limited amount of time, but one of the fundamental issues that I find in working with companies, and particularly younger companies, is that there is oftentimes an initially great idea and a spark of an idea that could be truly transformative and is intended toward the good, whatever we might define that to be and however we might inspect that idea. But of course, that idea of good also frequently meets the complications of making a company profitable. You can do well and do good at the same time. And that's one of the messages that I want to embed in this conversation and have anybody listening take away with. But very frequently, what I see is that a well-intended idea tends to move toward a financial profit model very quickly, especially if you don't have strong thinkers grounding you in your principles or don't have ethical, responsible principles built into the foundations of the idea. And if you're not hiring people who are aligned with that cultural attitude and intent on keeping it. And so many of the technologies that we have now that could actually be developed to solving magnificent and important social problems will ultimately be, I think, developed toward the most lucrative and most dominant financial model that a company can provide themselves. And that's something to watch out for, right? What I found is that it's not the best ideas that are funded or the most important ideas that are funded. It's frequently the most profitable ones, and companies know that, and they also have a bottom line, and that is the direction that they will tend to move. And so I think that when we're talking about responsible tech practices, it's also important to examine the financial context and our financial incentives and the financial structures that undergird them.
And what I will say for that, and this is what I always like to call when I'm on like a panel or something, the butt capitalism kind of situation, where we're within a capitalist system. So how does that work when you have things that are not always aligned with that, in the sense that when we think of human communication, that traditionally was under the realm of governmental bodies that would not necessarily have that same incentive structure, but as the quote unquote public square has gone into publicly traded companies, therein sometimes lies the rub for that. And I think one way to kind of analyze it, which is connected with the responsible tech ecosystem and the startups that are getting involved, or groups like Responsible Innovation Labs that are really thinking about this, or Pro Design Network, Pro Social Design Network, and others, is this combination, right? You have the VCs, the LPs, the investor side, and then you have the startup community. But then you also, we have to think about the individual and what is their role in affecting that in terms of what products do they adopt. So not robbing the individual of their own kind of agency for determining kind of their own kind of alignment with values, with what products they end up utilizing. So I think that's a key part. But I know we want to dig into a few questions again by that article that you had come out just a few weeks ago. We shared it in the newsletter as well. We'll try to share that in the chat. But one of the things that struck me about it that I wanted to bring up is how the responsible tech ecosystem, and then specifically a lot of the individuals who are either working in this space, whether it's responsible AI, trust and safety professionals, public interest technologists, and others, how that's really evolved. And then you cite 2016 as a watershed moment. So tell us a little bit about that, why you see that as a watershed moment. And I know a lot of your work is also looking at pivotal kind of water cooler moments and how they also potentially affect the ecosystem and the types of people getting involved in it.
Sure. So I'll give what I hope will be a short snapshot of a few moments in time that I think really impacted the direction of the responsible tech industry and the model that we are winding up at now. In 2016, if we can all take our time machines back to a pretty
pre-COVID.
Yeah, I want people to think about, the Obama administration era glorification of the tech industry. Obama really set up the tech industry to profit, set financial incentives, and created alliances between government and tech, and uplifted tech leaders to a position of authority in our society. These were the days in which companies like Meta, companies like Google were really seen as forces of good. Facebook at the time was connecting the world. Google was committed to not doing evil, right? So these companies at that particular moment were set up and really held in the view of the public and the view of government and the view of people who were really kind of formative in shaping public opinion as pivotal and forces for good. And in 2016, what happened was, with Donald Trump's election, there was suddenly some self-reflection within the tech industry, but also public criticism of mechanisms that for the first time people were really thinking about as intervening into and potentially tearing apart the fabric of our social democracy and our society writ large. These were the moments where the Cambridge Analytica scandal was revealed, where there were concerns about Russian bots taking over and manipulating public discourse, where social contagion studies had shown that the company may have altered algorithmic flows to intensify those social divisions that were newly apparent in that moment. If you remember going back to that 2016 moment, and I recall this very strongly, one particular image circulated, and that was a video of at the time President Obama, who was speaking in ways that seemed quite unlike himself, but in language and in a voice that was utterly his. And it was revealed to be a deep fake, with Jordan Peele actually voicing Obama, with the video so at the time perfect in its verisimilitude that many people were concerned that this new technology would be taking over and causing new confusion in our ability to say what is true and what is not. We've only seen that grow. But in that particular moment, people were newly concerned about the role that tech products and the tech industry was playing in changing our social fabric in ways that we were not prepared for. In that moment, because of that public concern, what we saw fomenting was what I like to call a tech clash or a backlash against And in that 2016, 2017, 2019 moment, companies responded to that techlash, including consumer demands for change that were, backed by consumer opportunities to spend money where they want to spend money. We saw companies hiring new teams of diversity, equity, inclusion leaders, really thinking about responsible technology in a new way. Salesforce hired the first chief ethical officer, and many companies followed suit in developing this infrastructure in their organizations. This persisted along a line of companies doing this, creating these kinds of teams up until about 2022, at which point, due to both the financial constriction in the industry, a recession of venture capital, and another important signal, which is Elon Musk's purchase of the artist formerly known as Twitter, now X. And what he did is he laid off a bunch of trust and safety teams and sent a signal to industry that other companies could do this similarly and not face backlash and still maintain their product at a lower cost to them. We're seeing, by the way, I think the impact of that in seismic ways up to today with Zuckerberg's laying off of trust and safety today, as well as Musk's utility of that platform to further his political ambitions and to really take control of the political atmosphere and put into power the people that he wanted to put into power, which will then, in turn, most likely benefit his bottom line. So there's a confluence of these things that I just wanted to flag. But to go back to 2022, in this moment, there's one other watershed moment, which is that then President Biden, or newly exiting President Biden, introduced what he called the AI Bill of Rights, or the Executive Order on AI, which instituted a number of different maintained practices and proposals about how to move forward in technological progress and production in a way that was aligned with the history and the American commitment to civil rights. And so this moment really changed the structure of responsible tech practices and organization. What we saw in the dissolution of teams dedicated to diversity, equity, inclusion, responsible technology actually became more integrated roles where individuals working in responsible tech practices would work across teams. So new organizational structures for responsible tech practices that I would argue actually facilitated better communication and better integration of these practices, which were, I think, to the deficit of these organizations priorly siloed when these teams were maintained as teams that were apart from, for example, product or, for example, business practices. And so in this 2022 moment, we saw a new kind of responsible tech figure emerge, somebody who was really responsible for working across different teams in an organization, somebody who was multilingual in their ability to think across different structures and strategies of an organization. And where we are right now, I think, is still that kind of practitioner as a responsible technology practitioner. Now, the caveat is that with an incoming administration that has committed itself to repealing the executive order, or the AI Bill of Rights, we now, I think, are in some uncertain waters in terms of how these jobs will be maintained in organizations. One important thing to recall is that the AI Bill of Rights was not only a proposal about how to move forward in a way aligned with civil rights and responsible tech practices, it was also a mandate that had particular impact into, for example, contract procurement companies. So companies would have to, under the AI Bill of Rights, demonstrate a level of alignment with and commitment to those practices in order to gain government procurement. That was really pivotal because it actually connected a financial incentive for companies. Many tech companies get off the ground, do well, ultimately end up flourishing because of their ability to access publicly funded, taxpayer-funded government contracts, including, by the way, Elon Musk, who got his company Tesla off the ground due to those taxpayer-funded government contracts and benefited significantly from them, as a bit of an aside. But those contracts were really committed to those ideologies as well. And so there was a really important alignment between financial incentives and the incentives of responsible technological production. Doing well and doing good was fundamentally aligned. And this facilitated not only roles in industry and civil society, but also within companies to match that kind of government vision and
Mhm.
government incentive and company incentive. 2025 is a bit of an unknown, and I'm sure that there are some questions that will get us to dig in a little bit deeper there.
I like to say 2025, let's survive, right? So let's have that as the minimum. But to build on your point, there's obviously a lot of unknowns. You mentioned DEI. I'd also say ESG has also become kind of like a delicate word where you see a lot of shifts with job titles. I think one of the frustrating parts for people in the ecosystem is to understand, right? How do we illuminate what these jobs are when sometimes that might shift? Give an example with something like election integrity. Sometimes you saw, instead of those individuals being transitioned out of the company, they're just changing their job titles are being changed, right? Maybe it's just integrity or a change in the title, because sometimes words become kind of like I don't know, problematic in the sense of what they are associated with. So I'd love to understand, Deb, from your research, and then specifically going back to this article, you talked about this kind of like catch 22, if you will, where you have these individuals who've been in the space for a bunch of years. You mentioned Salesforce with their kind of ethical and responsible tech kind of part and positions that they have. So you have individuals who might have a decade of experience. They sometimes create their own job, or they go through a side door. Now you have, because this is a field, because people are checking out responsible tech job board or a guide, they're trying to say, all right, well, where do I get experience with this? How do I get that original kind of experience? What are you seeing as the current struggle? And then what are you seeing as potential ways to alleviate some of these kind of pain points for this audience? So I'm specifically talking about entry-level individuals, sometimes struggling to understand how they get this initial experience and what the ecosystem looks like.
Right. So let me first of all explain a little bit about the catch-22. What we see in general, and I teach undergraduates, is that undergraduates tend to graduate and they are some of the most idealistic folks out there going into the workplace. They are newly assured of their role in society as building society for the good. They come oftentimes out of programs where they are immersed in intellectual questions about the good, ethical questions, uh, questions around kind of developing a better social fabric. And then they meet the workplace, and the workplace is somewhat hostile to that ideology. If you are, in particular, a lower level worker, your job is to fill the function which you were hired, not to impose your idealism. That I think is the true for many of the jobs, particularly in the tech industry. What we're seeing is that responsible tech roles, when they do exist, and to the extent that they are continuing to exist in industry, are typically jobs that require a number of degrees or years of experience in an industry. A company wants to hire somebody who has some organizational experience, who has some even managerial experience, to allow them to go and work across teams or to propose ways of synchronicity. And that means that, regardless of what your training is as an undergraduate, you meet a very harsh reality, which is that these jobs typically require significant amount of experience. And increasingly, what we're seeing, what the research is showing, is that companies are double tasking technical workers with responsible functions as well, so that you need not only some experience, but some technical training on top of that in order to access some of these roles. Now, even in those contexts, it's very hard for hirers to identify somebody who might have some technical training, even some experience in an organization, as somebody who has the capabilities and is equipped to think in responsible technological ways. And so
Mhm.
there's really not a clear match for hirers who oftentimes are faced with unclear directives about how they want to hire for this, and an unclear portfolio or set of characteristics that they want to hire for. So this is very kind of like touch and go within a company without any clear directives. Now, if you look, for example, at many other professional programs, you want to hire a lawyer, you get somebody with a JD, right? That's a
Mhm.
very clear directive as to what somebody is trained to do. In the responsible tech industry, we know that there is a need. We know that there are folks hiring for this. We know roughly what they want in terms of an outcome, but in terms of qualifications, there's still a lot of nebulous uncertainty. And I think that one of the things that I would like to see happen is some level of codification of those
Mhm.
skills and some level of metrics as to what responsible tech practices, when properly instituted, should have as an outcome. One of the disadvantages of what I want to call responsible tech 1.0, that's that 2016 to 2022 moment, is that there were many people who were deliberating ethical issues or thinking about responsible tech practices, or in activist way talking about DEI, but really very little, I think, set of metrics and expectations about what the
Mhm.
output of that should be in terms of making a product, for example, more accessible, or making a product more responsible, or making a company more responsible or accountable. And so, what I would like to see happen is a development of clear metrics as to what people in these roles should accomplish, some codifications as to what skills or background they might have in order to be able to accomplish these things. And then I think what we can start to see is the development of pipelines so that we have trained individuals who have the skills, who have the equipment, and who know what they're doing and understand what they want in terms of an impact. Companies that
Mhm.
know what these roles should ultimately result in terms of impact. And once we have that, I think we can start to train people and send people through these pipelines so that they can get the jobs in which they can both flourish, succeed, and ultimately make an impact.
And do you see a disconnect right now? Obviously, you're heavily involved in the university setting. I know oftentimes we hear from a lot of students who might say, all right, well, I'm getting this certain degree, and now what does this field look like? So sometimes with a rise of any field, there has to be a connection between the kind of the business community and what the roles they need, and then the university setting to kind of align on those. So where do you think we're at right now? Because I would argue you mentioned lawyers and JD and then passing the bar. Obviously, original lawyers then go to law school, and then you have professionalized systems like being a doctor, right? Doctors started out as grave robbers, right? So any field is going to be nascent until it's professionalized, until it reaches that point. So where are we right now? And then what are you seeing from the university side? Since I know we have a lot of
Yeah.
professors and admin and students in our community as well.
Look, I think that there have been a number of really good faith efforts to integrate responsible tech curricula into um, uh, undergraduate education in particular. So you can look, for example, at James Mickens, a professor at Harvard, who is responsible for the embedded ethics curriculum. I think that's a really good faith effort. I think that all STEM curricula should include some degree of ethical training. I
Mm-hmm.
look with gratitude at, for example, the development of the Belmont principles in the biomedical community for thinking about how they want to professionalize doctors to become responsible practitioners of that industry in light of the historical understanding of ways in which medicine has veered into sometimes horrific practices. You can look at the Tuskegee experiments and
Mm-hmm.
the Nazi medical experiments as two formative examples of that. I think that where this disconnect ultimately is most manifest is that in graduate training programs in particular, what I'm seeing is students are interested in figuring out how to get themselves marked or qualified, or how to send a signal that they have particular training. Now, because we see that the jobs in industry devoted to responsible technology and to responsible tech practices are aligned with people with some degree of maturity and experience. Maturity, I just mean as having spent some time in industry already, not on the intellectual or developmental level. I certainly think that undergraduates have high level of maturity, sometimes higher as graduate students. I say this as somebody who's both a graduate and a graduate student and may have had more maturity as an undergraduate in many ways. But I do think that what I see at Berkeley is a number of students who take my classes come up to me and they say, how can we get into this industry? How do I identify myself as somebody who has some skills already or some technical experience as moving or wishing to move in that direction? How do I signal to employers that I have these skills? And that's still a really muddy question. And I think that the best way to clarify that question is to offer ways of marking or certifying people as qualified and equipped with these kinds of skills. I
Very.
think that people look on LinkedIn, right? We are on LinkedIn right now. Look at somebody's LinkedIn. What certifications do they have? What badges do they have on their LinkedIn? It matters to recruiters. It matters to hirers if you can announce or signal that kind of certification. And so I think that there are opportunities right now to create those kinds of certifications, not just so that people can market or brand themselves well, but so that in this formative moment, we can really deliberate what it means to be a responsible tech practitioner, what kinds of skills somebody should ideally have when they are applying for those roles. And we should have all of the intellectually diverse and experientially diverse people in this community thinking about what those skills are so that it isn't just the tech companies making the decisions about which skills they want these people to have themselves. Certainly they are stakeholders, but they are not the only stakeholders in responsible tech practices. If you're here today, you're a stakeholder most likely. And if you're not here today, you're probably still a stakeholder because you're using these products ultimately too. And so my vision for this is that we get a group of stakeholders together to deliberate what a responsible tech worker should ideally look like. And we do this proactively so that we, as a diverse and intellectually robust group of people deliberating this issue, have a say in what responsible tech practices and what responsible tech outcomes look like in industry for these roles.
And I think that's why a lot of your piece talked about the need for collaboration between the orgs, the companies doing the hiring, between educational institutions and other upskilling opportunities. Obviously, that's easier said than done, but to your point, to make sure that we, as a whole of society, are defining what these kind of needs are. And then another part that you mentioned, making sure that we can signal who is focused on this. I think that is always kind of the struggle. Did see a quick question asking if we're going to be sharing all of these links, Deb, that you mentioned. Yes, we'll do a write-up of this discussion, because I know, Deb, you mentioned a lot of great resources that we want to make sure everybody has quick access to. You're going to find that in our newsletter. If you go to alltechhuman.org, you'll see our newsletter link. If you don't currently subscribe, it comes out every 2 weeks. I hope you're part of it. So, Deb, lastly, as we head out of here, what's the advice that you give to somebody then, if you mention all of these grad students that you're talking to, maybe they're struggling with this? That's also a proxy for everybody kind of tuning in or watching later, of people who are wondering how the space is evolving and how they can find themselves in it. And then lastly, before you head out, just tell people how you can how people can stay in touch with some of your incredible work.
Yeah, I think that, look, to answer the question, I only have a few minutes and I know we're already running late, but I'll answer this in a little bit of a roundabout way, and forgive me for the roundabout. On my show, I host a show on ethics and technology. It's called Technically Human. We should be back up and running in a few weeks, taking a little bit of time to focus on writing projects, but we'll be putting out episodes coming up relatively soon. But on an episode of the show, I interviewed a guy who, his name is Ketan Anjaria. he's out there. He's the CEO of a company called Hired Club, and he looks at how you can use social networks to get people hired. And I asked him on that episode, what's the biggest mistake that a new undergraduate makes when applying for a job? And his answer was applying for the job. Because when you submit a resume these days, it's going to get looked at by an automated resume scanner and a hiring manager who may not necessarily look with any great depth as to whether or not the kind of person that you are, the kinds of things that you offer, fit the kind of role that there may be out there. There's going to be an alignment between something like keywords, right, and keywords. But people hire very frequently based on the principle of trust. This is why social networks are so important to getting hired. When people hire, they have a sense of who a person is, and they can recommend that person based on that principle of trust and say, hey, I know this person. I know who you are. I know what this company wants to do. Hire this person. And so I say this as to say that the best strategy that you have if you're interested in this space is to cultivate community and cultivate networks with other people in that space. Get to know them. Spend some time really developing your social network around this context. Not pinging everybody you know, but finding the people who really are doing things that are interesting to you and asking questions that are true, genuine questions about how you can end up in that space, or what they do, or what makes them understand the value of their work. A genuine question to somebody who's aligned with you will open up doors. And this is why I think the All Tech is Human community is so spectacular and so important. It is a network provided for you to create and facilitate those connections. Now, I am not a connection maximalist. I don't think that the most connections, qua Mark Zuckerberg, facilitate the best social context. But I am incredibly committed to depth of connection. And so you can look at somebody's portfolio and identify whether or not there's a depth of connection for you, and leverage and enlist true connections that have depth to developing your social network. Somebody who connects with somebody who's genuinely, truly interested, where there's an alignment, will not just give advice. They'll store that person in their mind. And then when they see somebody hiring, or they see an opening or an opportunity, they'll introduce that person, say, hey, you should really meet this person, or check out this person, spend some time there. Again, not because you have the most connections, but because you have the depth of connection in the connections that you make. So I encourage folks to find that kind of community. I think that All Tech is Human is doing a tremendous job of it. And then if you're at a university, offer course, take the course. Take it, even if it seems outside of your bandwidth. A nice email to a professor expressing interest may override at times a blockage in terms of the curricular opportunities that your guidance counselor has. If there is a class, an opportunity, a lecture, take it. Not just because you never know what somebody might say, but you never know who you might meet.
That's a beautiful way, Deb, for us to end our conversation. Just want to underline that point of community. That's why at All Tech is Human, we're focused on the three elements, right, of community, education, careers, this kind of whole system approach, this holistic approach. I got to say, with a nascent kind of field like responsible tech, having that community, having people you know, having a mentor. I saw that question about the mentorship program, which for All Tech is Human is going to be starting just in a few weeks, with a notification going out. But then also join our Slack, or if you're in a area where we have in-person gatherings. And then as another exciting part, what we're going to be trying to do in the coming months is having a ATIHX type of program where independently organized gatherings can happen all across the globe, because we're seeing how people are just meeting up, like in Philadelphia and Paris and Boston, just in the last couple of weeks, using Slack to. They appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for all the great conversation pieces and comments that you had. Again, we'll follow up in a video with a write-up that's going to have all the resources like Deb's article and some of the resources that she mentioned. So please stay in touch. I'm David Polgar with All Tech is Human. Thank you to Deb Donig.
Thank you all. Lovely to connect.